B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, January 7th, 2020. Trump continues to threaten Iran. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is lying about his lies, according to one of the pundits. And as the U.S. fumbled, recalling a memo agreeing to pull U.S. troops out of Iraq, the whole picture is an ugly mess that risks major escalation. And we learned today that Iran has identified 13 targets after Trump said he's got 52 that he will attack if there is a military response from Iran. Now, his threats are ridiculous. The Iranians, their threats are credible. And the leaders and representatives of Iran are making it very clear that they wouldn't attack U.S. cultural sites. They wouldn't attack ordinary civilians. They're targeting legitimate military bases or facilities. One of their news agencies identified that there are 27 U.S. bases that are close to Iran's border, already on high alert, and they are within range of medium and long-range missiles that Iran is known to have. Now, the U.S. pundits who are trying to shape the narrative here and make us believe that Iran isn't much of a threat, they say, their missiles aren't that accurate. Well, I think we're going to find out here in short order. And in Iran, members of the so-called resistance axis, including pro-Iranian militias from Iraq, are meeting over the next 48 hours to discuss tactics. One of the leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps warned on Tuesday that Iran will set ablaze the places Americans love. And speaking to a crowd of thousands in Suleimani's hometown, Kerman, where 50 people died in a stampede as part of the funeral procession, he said, "We will take revenge, a revenge that will be tough, strong, decisive, and finishing, and will make them regret." Now, one of the things we know about Iran is they don't like to lose face. And so I take these threats of retaliation very seriously. And the foreign minister has insisted the Iranian response will be proportionate and not conducted by surrogate forces. This is an act of aggression against Iran, and it amounts to an armed attack against Iran. We will respond proportionately, not disproportionately. We are not lawless like President Trump. Now, I am lifting these comments from a report in The Guardian, dated today, January 7th. And in it, for the first time to my knowledge, they report on what we shared with you yesterday, the scoop that Max Blumenthal got, because he paid attention to the entire speech given to the Iraqi parliament by its Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi. And this we shared with you yesterday in our report, that General Suleimani was in Iraq to bring a message from Iran intended to be delivered through the mediation of Iraq to its regional rival, Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a very important aspect because it shows the treachery of Donald Trump apparently orchestrating this in the name of peace or at least de-escalation and setting up Suleimani for his drone execution. And we'll come back to that thread in a moment. But one of the other things that Trump did today, claiming that this is just incidental, accidental, coincidental, but they released a photo from the Utah Hill Air Force Base with exactly 52 F-35 jets on a massive runway. Now, we know Trump doesn't read much. He's a TV guy. Pictures mean a lot to him. And I do not believe the bullshit that this was just a photo that happened to surface and the timing is not intentional. And the other thing we don't admit, I heard Rush Limbaugh, he got Trump on his radio show yesterday, and he's all pumped up. And he loves the F-35. It's a stealth fighter. But not only is this the most expensive aircraft the Pentagon has ever produced, its track record really sucks. We've been late to deploy them in combat. There have been many problems in test flights and test bombing runs. And so, like Israel's Iron Dome, like our Patriot missiles and other Star Wars defense systems, this is mostly bluster. And get this. The New York Times followed up with some of the survivors of the 1979 hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. There were a total of 52, and currently 35 remain alive. And Trump thinks that he is somehow honoring them by selecting 52 sites, including sensitive cultural sites that attacking would be a war crime. And so, in general, these survivors say, I don't want any part of this. Here's a former hostage, John Limbert. Mr. President, if you're listening, please don't bother yourself on my account because I want nothing to do with it. And Chuck Scott, an 88-year-old retired Army colonel, says, we've all gone on with our lives. There are fewer and fewer of us every year. We're not part of it anymore. What has happened in the past week has no association with us. And so we'll see just how honored those people feel by this gesture from Trump. Meanwhile, Mike Pompeo, in a news conference in Washington today, provided no new details on what prompted the killing of General Suleimani, but he just maintains stoutly that it was in response to an imminent attack that he was planning. Quote, if you're looking for imminence, you need to look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Suleimani. He's referring to the U.S. airstrike that was in retaliation for the death of still an unnamed military contractor in Kirkuk, Iraq. We've blamed it on Iranian-backed militia, but there is no evidence for any of this. We just have to trust Mike Pompeo, right? It was the right decision. We got it right, he said. And then he scoffed at the idea that Suleimani was in Baghdad on some sort of a diplomatic mission and said, given his discussions with the Saudi defense minister on Monday, that the Saudis also didn't believe it. Now the Saudis have no credibility. They continue to cover up their murder and dismemberment of Khashoggi at their consulate in Istanbul just a little over a year, maybe 15 months ago now. And Pompeo went on. He doubled down. He said, anybody here believe that Soleimani was a diplomat? Is there any history that would indicate it was remotely possible that this kind gentleman, this diplomat of great order, Qasem Soleimani, traveled to Baghdad for the idea of conducting a peace mission? I made you reporters laugh this morning. That's fantastic. We've heard these same lies before. It is fundamentally false. He was not there on a diplomatic mission trying to resolve a problem. Well, it's Pompeo's word against the Iraqi prime minister. And I don't know much about this current Iraqi leader, but all I can tell you is Mike Pompeo has zero credibility, and even if Mahdi has 0.1 credibility, I'll lean in his direction. Also, I want to thank listener Henry Garciga. He responded to my plea yesterday. If you saw any coverage of the Max Blumenthal report or something similar, that Soleimani was there trying to broker a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Well, Henry Garciga reports that over at Veterans Today, Gordon Duff reported on it. Today, I just quoted from the Guardian article that refers to it, but only to capture the denial. And at Consortium News, our friend Pepe Escobar is back He was just there yesterday. He's a busy guy. And he said the bombshell facts were delivered by caretaker Prime Minister Mahdi during an extraordinary historic parliamentary session in Baghdad Sunday. Soleimani had flown into Baghdad on a normal carrier flight carrying a diplomatic passport. He had been sent by Tehran to deliver in person a reply to a message from Riyadh on de-escalation across the Middle East. Those negotiations had been requested by the Trump administration. That's where the treachery comes in. So, Pepe continues, Baghdad was officially mediating between Tehran and Riyadh at the behest of Trump, and Soleimani was a messenger. Mahdi was supposed to meet Soleimani at 8:30 Baghdad time Friday morning, but a few hours before, Soleimani died as the object of a targeted assassination at the Baghdad airport. The fact is that the United States government on foreign soil as a guest nation has assassinated a diplomatic envoy who was on an official mission that had been requested by the United States government itself. And Pompeo, doubling down, basically says, you're going to believe me, you're not going to believe the Iraqi prime minister. And there's more in Escobar's report. He basically says that if Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, it could lead to a worldwide depression. And I'm not the biggest fan of Jennifer Rubin, an opinion columnist at the Washington Post, but she has it right today. Headline, Mike Pompeo is now lying about his lies. Pressed to explain what threat was imminent, Pompeo haughtily replied, if you're looking for imminence, you need to look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Soleimani. In other words, there was nothing concrete, nothing different from what we have witnessed for days or weeks or months. When asked about the president's plans to destroy cultural sites, a war crime, Pompeo arrogantly proclaimed it was Iran that had done damage to Persian culture. So that would make any war crimes acceptable? He then falsely insisted that he didn't deny in an interview Sunday that the president wanted to hit cultural sites. We have now reached the point where Pompeo lies about his lies. It was evident from the fact that Trump was given a menu of options regarding action against Iran that there was no specific event pertaining to Soleimani. The strike was conducted to retaliate for prior Iranian aggression, and it was the most extreme option, potentially a trigger for war, taken without congressional authorization. In a sense, she says, this is worse than the run-up to the Iraq War, when both Democrats and Republicans were wrongly convinced or talked themselves into believing the intelligence was conclusive of the evidence of the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Here, the administration is not even pretending. Now, back during the invasion, the early days of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I was hosting a syndicated radio show. It was also on satellite, on Sirius satellite radio. And one of the things we did is we had a friend of mine, Jim Foster, who's a great guy with a booming voice. He played the role of General Jimbo. And we pretended that there was this place at the Pentagon where media just called up and you were assigned a general to come on and deliver Don Rumsfeld's talking points of the day. And we did that as satire over what was going on the news channels here in the United States. Well, Lee Fung, a scrappy investigator over at The Intercept, he's taken a look at the TV pundits who've popped up on TV in the last few days. Jack Keane, a retired Army general appearing on Fox News and NPR to praise Trump for killing Soleimani. Should have happened a long time ago, he told Lou Dobbs. Well, Keane works for military companies, including General Dynamics and Blackwater, currently serves as a partner at SCP Partners, a venture capital firm investing in defense contractors. That was not disclosed in either interview. Then there's Van Hipp with two Ps, chair of the lobbying firm American Defense International, representing Raytheon, Palantir, General Atomics, the manufacturer of the MQ-9 Reaper drone that was used in the Soleimani slaying. He published an opinion column on the Fox News website with no recognition of the details that Lee Fung just exposed. And then there's David Petraeus, who's been back on television despite his disgrace and his guilty plea on a patsy charge of mishandling classified information. Petraeus now works for Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. That's the venture capital firm with holdings in several major defense contractors. And the list goes on. Jay Johnson, who was Obama's Homeland Security Director and used to be a reasonable guy, he said Suleimani was a lawful military objective and the president, under his constitutional authority, had ample domestic legal authority to take him out. Jay Johnson is now getting $310,000 a year in cash and stock for serving on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin. So these are the voices that the corporate media select to inform us and analyze these reckless and dangerous moves by Trump. And in general, my view is the Democrats like to say Suleimani was a bad guy. They generally approve of his assassination. But they quibble over the method, the lack of notice, the lack of approval, a lot of process stuff, but not the fundamentals. And I've linked to Kevin Gostola's analysis of General Petraeus' appearance on Face the Nation and other programs in recent days. I recommend you read that. I've also linked to his piece from a couple of days ago, where he tries to identify the State Department's propaganda for escalating the war against Iran. Then there is the ever-reliable Rachel Maddow. I watched her show last night, as usual, and in setting up for a softball half-hour interview with Elizabeth Warren, she walked through the Bolton story. Then she talked about the Iraq element, did not mention the diplomatic mission that Suleiman reportedly was on. She plugged Julian Castro's endorsement of Elizabeth Warren. And in her setup piece, she only talked about Warren's position related to Trump and the assassination of Suleimani. No mention of the other candidates, including Bernie Sanders, who has the clearest anti-war position and would put Elizabeth Warren's to shame if they were compared side by side. So they did talk a little bit about foreign policy, about regime change wars, but I came away feeling that Elizabeth Warren doesn't have a real strong grasp of foreign policy and military policy. And Maddow permitted her to meander through a lot of her talking points. They're good policies. I support her wealth tax. I support her attacks on the rich. She does it without sounding socialist like the Burn. But overall, it was an infomercial for Elizabeth Warren. And it glossed over what I consider to be her weak positions on foreign and military policy. Then there is that errant letter, we're told. It was just a draft. It was from a top general in Iraq to his counterpart in the Iraqi administration, acknowledging that the prime minister in the non-binding resolution was asking U.S. troops to leave and saying, all right, we'll get up and go here, but it's going to take a little while. We're going to have a lot of helicopters in the sky. We're going to do the withdrawal at night so it doesn't disturb civilians. That seems more disturbing. Anyway, we are told that that was just a draft, and it accidentally was released, and it shouldn't have been, and it just shows what a leaky ship the Pentagon is these days. Over in Iran, they are matching the ridiculous moves of the United States last year when we named the top military leaders terrorists and imposed sanctions on them. So the Iranian parliament has declared America's top military leadership to be terrorists. And they're saying that they've pushed through a bill on an emergency process to make this a reality, and they allocated just $223 million in extra money to respond to the current provocation from the United States. Now, here's an interesting move. Mark Esper is the current Secretary of Defense. He used to be a Raytheon executive, and he is bucking Trump on the issue of attacking Iranian cultural sites. He said the Pentagon will not do that. He said it would be a war crime. And he said, quote, "We will follow the laws of armed conflict." When a reporter asked if that meant no, Esper agreed. That's the laws of armed conflict, he said, complete with grammatic error. And even Mitch McConnell is saying he volunteered this. He wasn't even asked. That's not appropriate, said McConnell, talking to reporters. He made his comments unprompted at the top of his first news conference of the new year, before even being asked a question. But what does it mean? Those are just words. McConnell won't make any move to block Trump. And so it goes. The Gray Zone's Ben Norton reports accurately, and this was echoed by Iran's ambassador to the United Nations on the PBS NewsHour last night. Iran has no nuclear weapons. Iran is not developing nuclear weapons. They're simply flexing their muscles because the United States walked away from the six-nation nuclear agreement. And so they're increasing enrichment and doing what they can to kind of show their independence. And in addition, the leaders have strictly identified that they will only be attacking legitimate targets. And Lebanese Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said, "Our goal in the resistance axis is the expulsion of the American military forces from the whole region. All across the region, there are American citizens, traders, media people, journalists, companies, engineers, and doctors. They cannot be touched. In fact, I am saying that any harm to U.S. citizens and civilians anywhere will only serve Trump's agenda. It would be Trump's agenda." And back in February of last year, the supreme leader of Iran explained that the chant "Death to America," which is frequently played as a sinister phrase in U.S. media, he said the slogan is aimed at the political class in Washington and not the U.S. public. Khamenei said, U.S. officials complain and ask, why do Iranians say "Death to America"? Let me make something clear for U.S. leaders. Death to America means death to Trump, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo. It means death to American leaders. We have no problems with the American people. And this is a phrase that has bugged me for so long, because these kinds of jingoistic chants are rallying cries, but I don't believe that they are meant to be taken literally. And similarly, when Iran says they want to see Israel wiped off the map, they don't plan to kill every Israeli to achieve that. It's just a wish. It's an aspiration. But it's expedient to take it literally as the basis for ongoing confrontation. Now, Joe Biden is heading into really tricky territory here, because he claims that his experience is what makes him positioned to beat Trump. But his experience and his record is littered with bad judgment and incorrect calls. So here's Biden. Make no mistake, this outcome of strategic setbacks, heightened threats, chance of death to America. See, he's using it. This was avoidable. Calling Trump dangerously incompetent. Biden says his constant mistakes and poor decision-making have left the United States with severely limited options left to take, and most of those options are bad. He called on Trump to explain his decision. If there was an imminent threat that required this extraordinary action, we're owed an explanation. But this is a guy who has advocated violence, who has supported Israel in some of its most nefarious attacks on the Palestinians. And the more his record is exposed, in the current climate, I believe the weaker he will be perceived as Trump's opponent. I mentioned earlier that there was a stampede at Suleimani's funeral procession in his hometown of Kerman, and that 50 people died. Well, it's 56 now is the death count, and 213 were injured. The United States is violating UN protocol and longtime practices. We have denied a visa to Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, who was scheduled to speak at the United Nations this Thursday, January 9th. This, once again, shows that the U.S. is trying to control the narrative, trying to shut down any contrary or contradicting positions, and simply to package Iran as this center of terrorism. I think it's going to backfire. I don't think that these moves are going to have the effect that Trump desires. I want to thank our listener and supporter, Jerry Fresia. He's based in northern Italy, and he shared an analysis piece that was published by the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, and it offers interesting recent history about what occurred in the Middle East and North Africa in 2019, from Sudan and Algeria to Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran. All of these uprisings have opposed imperialism, authoritarianism, neoliberalism, poverty, corruption, religious fundamentalism, and sectarianism. Women have been active participants, often in the forefront. The participants are mostly working class and unemployed youth. These popular uprisings have been suppressed. The word in Iran is that at least several hundred people were killed in the protests that broke out on November 15th. We know about the ongoing popular protests in Iraq. Some aimed at getting Iranian influence out of the country. Some aimed at just trying to resume a normal life after 15 years of war and occupation and total dissatisfaction with the leadership in place. And the analysis reads, the popular uprisings in Iraq, Iran, and Lebanon will all suffer while the rulers who've been condemned by the protesters try to instrumentalize this crisis in their effort to remain in power. And we've seen that in Iran, where the funerals for Suleimani have brought millions of people to the streets. And I heard Rush Limbaugh say that, they go door to door and say, aren't you coming to the funeral? I have no evidence for that. I wouldn't be totally surprised. But I think this is largely an organic expression. Yesterday, I commented that Trump gave a speech to Hispanic evangelicals in Florida on Friday, just hours after the reports of the assassination of Suleimani. And he said, pandering, that God is on our side. And I referenced George W. Bush and his comment about the crusade against Islam after 9/11, which he quickly tried to scrub. And I would never expect that Donald Trump Jr. would be so arrogant and ignorant all at the same time to post a picture of himself on Instagram posing with an assault rifle, and the rifle has a 5-fold cross, the one that was carried by medieval knights on crusades in the Holy Land. Perfect, wouldn't you say? Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview to my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And my guest is Tom Muller, who's written a powerful new book about whistleblowers. It's called Crisis of Confidence, and it's a deep dive into a wide range of whistleblowers in corporate America, in the government, and I highly recommend the book. Our conversation focuses mostly on the national security whistleblowers that he profiles in the book. And here's an excerpt where he talks about the prosecution of whistleblowers, particularly under the Obama administration, shows that their treatment is a bipartisan problem.
Frankly, one of the things that I saw in writing my book was that the spread of wrongdoing and we're talking about national security, but it's also what led to the 2008 collapse, what led to 9/11, and what's leading to massive fraud, waste, and abuse in a number of industries, nuclear cleanup and pharmaceuticals and others. That it's bipartisan. This rot is bipartisan, and the reason that Donald Trump is in the White House today has a lot to do with what his predecessor Barack Obama did for 8 years, and what his predecessor George W. did in turn. So, there again, I think that there are people who have been shocked by my criticism of Obama because I have been critical of Trump, and I think that the blame deserves to be spread pretty widely. And there haven't been too many administrations that are good about whistleblowing on the one hand and true transparency on the other. And those things, of course, are integrally linked.
That's Tom Mueller, the author of Crisis of Conscience, the new book about whistleblowers. And I did clarify that he has no family relationship to St. Bob Mueller, the former FBI director and crack investigator of the Russiagate scam. Every day I like to thank people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast, and you subscribers get first crack at our in-depth interviews. That's your big benefit. Cheryl Fleming, Billy Cook, Terry Paris, we just mentioned her yesterday. That's because she has so many different subscriptions. And Dick Atlee, out on the coast in Maine. I appreciate each and every one of you and the support that you give, and I mention that so that others will follow along. If you want to subscribe, just visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can take it from there. If you don't like PayPal, yo comprendo, you can communicate with me at my P.O. Box number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, Mitch McConnell claims that he has the votes in the Senate to proceed with the impeachment trial without an agreement on whether witnesses and evidence will be permitted. Now, this would be new witnesses, new evidence. Otherwise, they will rely on the record created from the House hearings in Intelligence and Judiciary committees. McConnell claims he's counted all the votes, he's got what he needs. And this puts a lot of pressure on Nancy Pelosi to send over those articles of impeachment. Now, as I understand it, once she releases them, the trial in the Senate could begin within a day. That's very quick, and I don't know if the Chief Justice will be able to clear his golf schedule in order to preside. So, in addition to pressure from Republicans, we have Chris Murphy, a senator from Connecticut, Democrat, pressuring Pelosi to send him over. I think the Speaker should send the articles regardless. Asked if the time has come, he said, I think the time has passed. She should send those articles over. And, of course, with John Bolton's willingness to testify announced just yesterday, it is anybody's guess how the Republican majority will proceed. I want to send not just thoughts and prayers, but love to the people of Puerto Rico. You should be the 51st state already. And compounding the hurricanes that have devastated the island in recent years, the last week has seen a swarm of earthquakes. Yesterday it was 5.8. Today, 6.4. We have a report of a single fatality, a 73-year-old man in the city of Ponce killed by a wall that fell over. And there are widespread power outages once again across the island of Puerto Rico. A little further south in Venezuela, we reported yesterday on the corporate media's bad yellow journalistic reports on the efforts of Juan Guaido to once again claim that he is the legitimate leader of Venezuela. So on Sunday, the allies of Nicolas Maduro prevented him from getting into Parliament. They held a vote and named somebody else as the leader of the Parliament. That was the basis, it's the National Assembly, that Guaido had claimed a year ago, on January 23rd, when he stood up and said, I am the president. Now, under the Constitution, he could make that claim for 30 days, and then it expired. And so this latest effort, where today his forces stormed the Parliament building, held a vote even though all the power had been turned off, and it mirrored a rump vote that was taken on Sunday, where they got the opposition to once again named Juan Guaido as their leader. And I'm looking at coverage here from Britain's Guardian newspaper, which sees itself as a gatekeeper, always loading up their coverage with adjectives like authoritarian President Nicolas Maduro. In frantic scenes that spread rapidly on social media, Guaido and his backers were filmed physically forcing their way into the capital to cheers of Viva Venezuela. And they selectively quote Guaido's unofficial representative in London, who said Guaido emerges stronger from all of this. He has more legitimacy even than he did in 2019. Boy, that's a meaningless statement. Meanwhile, in Libya, things may be reaching a crisis point. The UN-backed government in Tripoli is under assault from the forces organized by Khalifa Haftar, or Hifter, who used to be a CIA asset. We don't know his current status. The main European countries involved in Libya, that's France, Germany, Italy, and Britain, are meeting in Brussels to discuss the crisis. And in a couple of days, there's going to be a meeting with Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russia's President Putin. That'll happen in Turkey on Wednesday. And despite the fact that the two leaders are backing different sides in the conflict, they may be able to put a deal together. If not, it appears that Hifter or Haftar may be the odd man out in Libya after the U.S.-backed UN intervention that killed its former leader, Muammar Gaddafi. And finally today, my colleagues over at whowhatwhy.org are building on a report from 60 Minutes on Sunday. I didn't see 60 Minutes because I was watching the Golden Globes, and Ricky Gervais got off a great joke about this topic. It was about that he didn't believe that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. And 60 Minutes interviewed a forensic specialist who'd been hired by the Epstein family, who makes a strong case that the markings on Jeffrey Epstein's neck suggest strangulation and not a suicide by hanging. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You are free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.